The United States began as a collection of 13 British colonies, each with a unique cultural identity. The foundations of American independence were laid in the 18th century, but the true frontier spirit of the Wild West would emerge only after a long struggle for freedom. By 1776, the American colonies were in open revolt against the British Empire. Tired of oppressive taxation and authoritarian rule, the colonists declared their independence. On July 4, 1776, the United States of America was born. This pivotal moment was the beginning of a long and tumultuous journey. However, the promise of freedom came with a deep sense of disillusionment, as the old class systems from Europe had left their mark on the new nation. The dream of a new beginning. For many settlers, the American West represented a chance at a fresh start. They sought to escape the rigid class systems of the East, where the lower classes had little hope of rising to prominence. The promise of free land, opportunity, and a new life pulled many Americans westward, toward the unknown. The Louisiana Purchase, 1883. The spark for the Wild West would come in 1883, when President Thomas Jefferson seized the opportunity to acquire the Louisiana Territory from France. This deal, known as the Louisiana Purchase, nearly doubled the size of the United States. It opened vast new lands for settlement, exploration, and ultimately conflict. Manifest destiny. With the newly acquired land, the belief in manifest destiny began to take root. This philosophical idea, coined in 1845, asserted that it was America's divine right to expand across the continent. The concept became a rallying cry for settlers who saw it as a moral duty to spread democracy, capitalism, and Christianity to the untamed lands of the West. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. In 1884, President Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark Expedition to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory and chart a route to the Pacific Ocean. The journey, lasting over 3 years, revealed the vast wilderness and potential of the West. However, it also introduced Americans to the complex web of relationships with Native American tribes, who had lived in the region for centuries. The role of Native Americans. The story of the Wild West is incomplete without understanding the role of Native Americans, whose territories were now being encroached upon by American settlers. While many settlers viewed their expansion as a divine mission, Native Americans saw it as an invasion. This inevitable conflict would shape the future of the West, often tragically for the indigenous populations. European competition. America was not the only imperial power seeking to expand its influence in North America. The Spanish Empire held vast territories in the Southwest, while the British maintained control over Canada. This led to growing tensions and an increasing sense of nationalism among Americans. The young nation would have to defend its newfound territories from foreign powers, setting the stage for the battles and wars that would define the early years of the West. The expansion and the American frontier, 1883, 1849. In the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase, the young United States was thrust into a new era of expansion and exploration. The dream of a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific became a driving force for settlers, but this vision would come at a tremendous cost. The struggle to tame the wilderness, build new cities, and establish law and order would be filled with hardship, conflict, and the clash of cultures. The impact of the Louisiana Purchase. When President Thomas Jefferson made the historic decision to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France in 1883, it was a turning point in American history. This acquisition doubled the size of the United States, creating a vast expanse of untapped land. The Mississippi River, which ran through the newly acquired territory, would soon become the lifeblood of American commerce, offering crucial trade routes for the goods that were soon to flood into the market. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. The success of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1884-1886, paved the way for further exploration of the Western Territory. With the help of the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark mapped thousands of miles across rugged terrain, meeting various Native American tribes along the way. Their journey proved that the land was fertile, but it also highlighted the diverse cultures and challenges that lay ahead for the settlers who would follow in their footsteps. Manifest destiny takes hold. By the 1840s, the idea of manifest destiny had gained widespread popularity. It was the belief that the United States was divinely destined to expand across the North American continent. This notion was reinforced by the growing political and economic influence of the United States, which had successfully asserted its dominance over European powers in the Western Hemisphere. As a result, thousands of settlers began migrating west, driven by the promise of new opportunities and the chance to forge their own future. The role of the wagon trains. The westward migration was largely carried out by families and individuals traveling in large wagon trains. These journeys were grueling, lasting months, and involved crossing treacherous mountains, arid deserts and hostile terrain. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail were some of the most famous routes used by settlers, and each was fraught with danger. Disease, lack of food and exhaustion claimed many lives, but the promise of fertile land kept the settlers moving forward. The struggles of the Native Americans. For the Native American tribes who had lived in these lands for centuries, the arrival of white settlers meant displacement, conflict and near destruction. As settlers pushed further west, many tribes found themselves pushed off their ancestral lands and forced onto reservation. Native American resistance to this encroachment was fierce, and many tribes resorted to armed conflict to protect their way of life. The Texas Revolution and the annexation of Texas. In 1836, Texas, then a part of Mexico, declared its independence after tensions between the Texan settlers and the Mexican government escalated. The famous Battle of the Alamo became a symbol of the resistance, and despite the defeat of the Texan forces, the rebellion would continue. In 1845, Texas was annexed into the United States, leading to further tensions with Mexico. This event, along with the growing desire to expand further into California and the Southwest, would soon spark the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War, 1846-1848. The annexation of Texas and the desire to acquire California and other territories led to the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. The war, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, was a significant conflict in the history of the American West. Under the leadership of President James K. Polk, the United States was victorious, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in. This treaty added over 500,000 square miles of territory to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico and parts of several other western states. The California Gold Rush. In 1848, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California triggered one of the largest mass migrations in American history. The California Gold Rush brought thousands of prospectors or 49ers to the West, eager to strike it rich. This influx of people transformed California into a bustling, chaotic state, and led to the rapid expansion of towns and cities along the Pacific coast. However, the gold rush also had devastating effects on the indigenous populations, who faced increased displacement and violence. The growing divide. As the United States expanded westward, it also faced growing internal divisions. The question of whether new territories would allow slavery or not became a contentious issue, ultimately contributing to the outbreak of the Civil War. The experience of the Wild West was heavily influenced by these divisions, with settlers from both the North and the South bringing their ideals and conflicts to the frontier. The railroads and the transformation of the West. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 was another major turning point in the history of the American West. The railroad connected the East Coast to the West Coast, making travel and commerce faster and easier. It also facilitated the settlement of new territories, as goods could now be transported more efficiently. The railroad brought new settlers, new businesses, and new opportunities, but it also brought with it new conflicts and challenges. The Lawless Frontier and the Rise of Frontier Justice, 1850-1870. Introduction. By the 1850s, the American West had evolved into a place of intense conflict, lawlessness, and opportunity. The rush for gold and the increasing population in newly established towns transformed the once wild frontier into a complex landscape of ambitious settlers, opportunistic outlaws, and the ever-present conflict with Native American tribes. This was a time when the myth of the Wild West began to take shape, fueled by tales of gunslingers, outlaws, and the struggle for survival. The Gold Rush and its impact. The California gold rush of 1849 brought with it thousands of fortune seekers, known as the 49ers, who descended upon the West in search of wealth. The gold fields were often chaotic, with few law enforcement officials and no established legal system. This led to an environment where crime, violence, and disorder ran rampant. In towns like San Francisco, Denver, and Deadwood, the sheer number of miners and settlers often outnumbered the capacity of local authorities to maintain order, and frontier justice became a way of life. The emergence of vigilantism. In the absence of formal law enforcement, local citizens often took matters into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed across the West to address crime and enforce what they saw as justice. These groups operated with little to no oversight, and were sometimes little more than gangs themselves. They would arrest, try, and execute criminals, often without due process. This form of justice, while seen as necessary by some, led to numerous cases of abuse and violence. The legend of the lawman. As settlements grew and communities became more established, the need for law enforcement became undeniable. The image of the lawman became a central part of the Wild West mythos. Figures like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became legendary for their efforts to maintain order in a chaotic and dangerous environment. These men were often hired as town marshals or sheriffs, tasked with maintaining peace in rapidly growing towns. However, their jobs were fraught with danger, as they had to contend with everything from petty criminals to violent gangs and even armed conflicts between settlers and Native Americans. The role of the U.S. Army. The Army played a crucial role in maintaining order on the frontier, especially as tensions between settlers and Native Americans escalated. Military posts were established throughout the West to protect settlers from Native American raids, as well as to keep an eye on the growing number of settlers moving into territories claimed by Native American tribes. The Army's presence was a double-edged sword. While it provided some degree of safety, it also intensified the conflict between settlers and Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. One of the darkest chapters of this period was the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral land. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the federal government to relocate Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi River. This led to the infamous Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans were forcibly moved to reservations in the West. Many died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure during the long journey. Conflict and resistance. As settlers moved west, they encountered various Native American tribes who had lived in these lands for centuries. The conflict between the two groups was inevitable, as settlers began encroaching on Native American hunting grounds and sacred lands. Native American resistance to this invasion was fierce, with many tribes waging armed conflicts against the U.S. Army and settlers. Some of the most notable Native American leaders of the time included Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo, who led their people in a series of desperate battles to preserve their land and way of life. The rise of the cowboy. While the settlers were busy staking claims and trying to tame the land, the rise of cattle ranching transformed the American West. The cowboy, an iconic figure in the Wild West mythos, was born from the needs of the cattle industry. Cattle drives, which began in Texas, became a major part of Western life. Cowboys were tasked with driving large herds of cattle to railheads, where the cattle could be shipped to markets in the East. The cowboy's life was harsh and often dangerous, and it was shaped by the demands of the cattle industry, as well as the need to defend ranches from rustlers and Native American resistance. The rise of outlaws and gangs. Alongside the cowboys, the Wild West saw the rise of numerous outlaws and criminal gangs. Men like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy became infamous for their exploits, which ranged from train robberies to bank heists. These outlaws were often seen as folk heroes by some, particularly those living in poverty, who viewed them as symbols of rebellion against the establishment. However, they were also ruthless criminals who often left a trail of violence in their wake. The legend of these outlaws would be immortalized in dime novels, books, and eventually Hollywood films, which would romanticize their lives and exploits. The battle for control of the West. As the West became more settled, the struggle for control of the land intensified. With the arrival of railroads and the expansion of mining operations, new towns and cities sprang up across the region. However, the West was still a dangerous place, and the law was often slow to arrive. Conflicts over land, water rights, and resources were common, and many settlers, miners and ranchers were forced to defend their claims with guns. The role of women in the West. While much of the focus of the Wild West revolves around men, women played a vital role in the development of the frontier. Many women accompanied their husbands on the perilous journey westward, and some even struck out on their own to claim land. Women in the West often had to contend with harsh conditions, but they also contributed to the growth of towns and communities. Women opened businesses, ran boarding houses, and taught in schools. Others worked in the burgeoning entertainment industry, or as prostitutes in mining towns. The lives of these women were often overlooked in the grand narrative of the Wild West, but their contributions were indispensable to the survival and success of frontier life. The Cowgirls, Outlaws and Settlers of the Wild West, 1870–1890. By the 1870s, the West was becoming increasingly populated, and the notion of the Wild West began to shift. While the landscape was still rugged and dangerous, the influx of settlers, lawmen, and the emergence of businesses and industries were slowly transforming the frontier into a more structured society. However, this transition was not without conflict. Native American resistance continued, lawlessness persisted, and the legend of outlaws and gunslingers grew ever larger. The transformation of the cattle industry. The cattle industry, which had been central to the early development of the West, entered a new era. By the 1870s, the booming cattle industry was firmly established, with cattle ranchers driving their herds to railheads where trains would carry the beef eastward. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 made it possible to transport cattle over vast distances, fueling the economy of the American West. As railroads expanded and settled into the region, towns like Abilene, Kansas and Dodge City, Wyoming, became bustling hubs for cattle drives. Cowboys, the rough-and-tumble men of the frontier, became the backbone of the cattle drives, but these men faced fierce competition and numerous challenges, including disease outbreaks among cattle and conflicts over land ownership. The open range was quickly disappearing, and ranchers began to enclose their lands with barbed wire, creating tensions with cattlemen, who relied on the open range. The rise of the cowgirl. Though the cowboy is the iconic image of the Wild West, women were also an integral part of the frontier. Some women, known as cowgirls, became skilled at handling cattle and working on ranches. They were often the wives or daughters of ranchers, but some struck out on their own. Cowgirls worked alongside men, branding cattle, riding horses and even participating in cattle drives. Women also worked in the expanding towns, running businesses, schools and churches. The saloon girls, often romanticized in popular culture, were a significant part of the Western landscape, and many of them were also entrepreneurs in their own right. Some women in the West gained a degree of financial independence through their work in bars, brothels, and laundries, while others were part of the more formal settler community, running boarding houses, farms, and schools. The legacy of outlaws and bandits. As law and order began to take hold in certain parts of the West, outlaws and bandits still roamed freely, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. The most infamous of these outlaws was Jesse James, a former Confederate guerrilla who became the leader of the James Younger Gang. James and his gang became legends, robbing trains and banks across the Midwest. Many people, especially those in rural areas, saw Jesse James as a folk hero, a man who fought back against an oppressive system, despite the criminal nature of his action. Other famous outlaws included Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, leaders of the Wild Bunch Gang, and Billy the Kid, a young gunfighter who became notorious for his involvement in numerous killings and his escape from the law. These outlaws were often romanticized in popular culture as rebellious heroes, though in reality they were ruthless criminals. Lawmen and the fight for justice. In the midst of this lawlessness, the role of lawmen became more critical. Sheriff Wyatt Earp and his brothers Bat Masterson and other notable figures like Doc Holliday became legends not for their enforcement of the law, but for their involvement in the violent confrontations that were central to the lawlessness of the time. One of the most famous of these events was the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. Wyatt Earp, along with his brothers and Doc Holliday, faced off against the Clanton-McClary gang in a gunfight that lasted only 30 seconds but became one of the most famous shootouts in American history. The gunfight symbolized the chaotic nature of frontier justice, where lawmen and outlaws alike were often armed and willing to use violence to settle disputes. The battle for Native American lands. While settlers and cattlemen expanded westward, the Native American tribes that had long inhabited the region fought to protect their homelands and way of life.
The U.S. government continued its campaign of forced relocation and assimilation, pushing tribes onto reservations and attempting to suppress their culture. Some Native American leaders, such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, led their people in armed resistance against the United States, culminating in several major battles. The most famous of these battles was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeated General George Armstrong Custer's 7th. The victory was a rare moment of triumph for Native Americans, but it was short-lived. In the aftermath of the battle, the U.S. Army intensified its efforts to subdue the Native American tribes, leading to further conflicts, massacres, and the eventual surrender of many tribal leaders. The Dawes Act and the end of the frontier. In 1887, the U.S. government passed the Dawes Act, which sought to break up tribal lands and encourage Native Americans to adopt a more civilized lifestyle by farming individually. The act resulted in the loss of millions of acres of Native American land, further diminishing their power and influence in the West. By the 1890s, the U.S. government had effectively broken the power of many Native American tribes, forcing them onto reservations and stripping them of their cultural heritage. At the same time, the frontier was rapidly being closed. In 18, Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was closed, meaning that there was no longer an uncharted wilderness to conquer. The once vast open spaces of the West were now divided into states, territories and reservations. The dream of limitless opportunity had been replaced by the realities of a settled, regulated society. The end of the Wild West. The closing of the frontier marked the end of the era often referred to as the Wild West. The cattle drives, gunfights and lawlessness that had defined the region slowly faded away as the government imposed order, the railroads connected the country, and industries grew. The myth of the Wild West, however, would endure, immortalized in dime novels, Hollywood films and the collective memory of the American people. Despite the end of the frontier, the legend of the Wild West continued to inspire generations of Americans. The Cowboys, Outlaws and Lawmen, who shaped the West, became symbols of independence, courage and resilience. The spirit of the West, however romanticized, remains a key part of the American identity.
The decline of the Wild West and the rise of a nation, 1890-1912. By the turn of the 20th century, the American West was changing rapidly. The days of lawlessness, open cattle ranges, and unregulated expansion were coming to an end. The development of the railroads, the closing of the frontier, and the increasing presence of the federal government marked the decline of the Wild West as it had been known. However, even as this era faded, the myth of the Wild West continued to shape the identity of the United States, leaving a lasting impact on American culture. The closing of the frontier. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was officially closed. This meant that there was no longer an unclaimed, unsettled land for pioneers to settle. The once untamed wilderness had been tamed, and the vast stretches of open land that had been central to the Wild West myth were now divided into states, cities, and private lands. The notion of the frontier as a symbol of opportunity and freedom was now a thing of the past. However, the closing of the frontier did not mean the end of the American spirit that had defined the Wild West. The closing merely marked the transition from a lawless, unsettled region to a more regulated, developed one. As the nation moved into the 20th century, the influence of the West on American culture remained strong, shaping the way Americans saw themselves and their place in the world. The expansion of railroads and industry. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 had already transformed the West, but by the 1890s, railroads had expanded even further, linking towns and cities across the country. This network of railroads facilitated the movement of goods, people and ideas, and played a central role in the development of the West. As railroads continued to expand, so too did industry. The mining industry, which had been central to the early Wild West, was now firmly established, and towns that had once been nothing more than temporary stops on the cattle drives and gold rushes began to grow into permanent settlements. Cities like Denver, Salt Lake City and Los Angeles became thriving centers of commerce, trade, and culture. The West, once seen as the land of rugged individualism, was now becoming part of a larger, more interconnected nation. The end of the cowboy era. As the cattle industry grew, so did the need for regulation and organization. The open range, where cowboys had once driven cattle freely, was quickly being replaced by fenced-in ranches. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s made it easier for ranchers to mark their territory, and soon cattle drives became less common as railroads and refrigerated cars made it possible to transport cattle more efficiently. The rise of large ranching operations and the increasing presence of government regulation led to the decline of the traditional cowboy lifestyle. The romanticized image of the cowboy as a lone adventurer riding across the open plains was slowly being replaced by a more industrialized, commercialized reality. The cowboy was no longer the symbol of the frontier, but rather a figure from a bygone era. Native American displacement and the Dawes Act. As the frontier closed, the U.S. government continued its policy of relocating Native American tribes onto reservations. The Dawes Act of 1887 aimed to break up tribal lands and encourage Native Americans to adopt a more civilized lifestyle, often involving farming. However, the policy was devastating for Native American community. It led to the loss of millions of acres of land and further undermined Native American cultures and traditions. Despite their best efforts to resist, Native American tribes were increasingly forced into a subjugated role. The U.S. Army, which had once fought the Native Americans in the Indian Wars, now played a key role in maintaining the peace on the reservations. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, where hundreds of Lakota Sioux were killed by the U.S. Army, marked the final chapter in the violent resistance of Native American tribes to American expansion. The impact of the Spanish-American War. While the Wild West was fading, the United States was emerging as a global power. In 1898, the Spanish-American War marked the nation's first significant military intervention outside of its own borders. The war was fought primarily over the control of Spanish territories, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The war itself was brief, but impactful. The U.S. victory over Spain cemented America's status as a rising imperial power, and the acquisition of new territories brought the U.S. into direct contact with foreign nations. The war marked the beginning of a new era for the United States, one in which its role on the world stage would become increasingly important. The Gilded Age and the growth of big business. The period following the Civil War is often referred to as the Gilded Age, a time of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of big business. This era saw the emergence of wealthy industrialists and entrepreneurs who built vast fortunes through railroads, oil, steel, and other industries. The Gilded Age also saw a growing divide between the rich and the poor, as the working class labored in poor conditions for low wages. While the Wild West had been a place of rugged individualism, the Gilded Age marked the rise of corporate power and political corruption. Many of the labor practices and injustices that had characterized the frontier were now taking root in the rapidly growing cities of the East. The working class, many of whom had come to America seeking opportunity, found themselves struggling to survive in a world controlled by large corporations. The myth of the Wild West in popular culture. As the Wild West faded into history, its mythos continued to thrive in popular culture. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of dime novels, which romanticized the stories of cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen. These novels, along with the growing popularity of Western-themed films and television shows, helped perpetuate the image of the Wild West as a place of adventure, danger, and opportunity. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which toured both the United States and Europe in the late 19th century, played a significant role in shaping the public's perception of the Wild West. The show featured reenactments of famous events, such as buffalo hunts and Indian battles, and helped cement the image of the West as a place of larger-than-life characters and heroic deeds. The end of the era. By the early 20th century, the United States had undergone a dramatic transformation. The Wild West, once a vast and untamed region, had been absorbed into a modern nation. The cattle drives had ended, the Native American tribes had been displaced, and the once legendary outlaws had either been captured or faded into obscurity. The frontier as it had existed for centuries was gone, and America was now a unified industrialized country. However, the spirit of the Wild West, the drive for independence, adventure, and opportunity remained alive in the American consciousness. The stories of the cowboys, the lawmen, and the outlaws continued to inspire generations of Americans, shaping the nation's identity and fueling its imagination. The legacy of the Wild West and its cultural impact, 1912 present. Introduction. By the early 20th century, the Wild West had become a memory, but its influence on American culture was far from over. The end of the frontier, coupled with the growing industrialization of the United States, gave way to a new phase in the nation's development. Yet despite the passing of the Wild West as a physical reality, its spirit lived on, influencing the American psyche, popular culture, and even the national identity. The legend of the Wild West would be perpetuated and transformed, forever etched into the fabric of the United States. The Wild West in popular culture. From the 1900s onward, the myths of the Wild West were continuously revived and reshaped. Hollywood, in particular, played a crucial role in perpetuating the Wild West myth. Western films became a genre of their own, with iconic stars like John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and Gary Cooper portraying larger-than-life cowboys and lawmen. These films were filled with gunfights, cattle drives, and saloons, imagery that became deeply ingrained in the American imagination. In the 1930s, the golden age of westerns began in Hollywood, with directors like John Ford creating timeless classics such as Stagecoach Night. These films idealized the struggle for justice, the rugged individualism of the cowboy, and the ongoing battle between good and evil. Even as the years went on, the Wild West continued to fuel movies, TV shows, and books, from Bonanza to Rawhide to Deadwood, each telling its own version of the frontier's legacy. The rodeo and the Wild West show. The Wild West also continued to live on through live performances, such as rodeos and Wild West shows. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured across the US and Europe in the late 1800s, played a pivotal role in crafting the myth of the frontier. The show depicted reenactments of historical events, showcasing trick riding, buffalo hunts, and cowboy life. It was a spectacle designed to entertain, educate, and reinforce the cultural significance of the West in American identity. Rodeos, which started as practical events for ranchers and cowboys to showcase their skills, became a popular sport in the 20th century, preserving many of the traditions and techniques associated with the cowboy lifestyle. Today, rodeos continue to be celebrated in the U.S., drawing millions of spectators each year. The continued struggle of Native Americans. While the Wild West's myth was celebrated in mainstream culture, it's important to remember the darker aspects of its legacy. For Native Americans, the westward expansion was an invasion that led to the destruction of their cultures, forced relocation, and systemic oppression. The U.S. government's policies, such as the Dawes Act and the Indian Removal Act, resulted in the forced relocation of countless tribes to reservation. The impact of the Wild West on Native Americans is still felt today, with many tribes fighting for recognition, sovereignty, and the protection of their land and cultural heritage. The Native American experience in the Wild West is often overlooked in popular culture, where the mythic narrative of westward expansion is typically told from the perspective of settlers and pioneers. However, in recent years there has been a growing movement to give Native Americans a more prominent voice in telling their own stories. Films like Dances with Wolves, 1990, and The Last of the Mohicans, 1992, along with Native American-led initiatives in literature and film, have helped shift the narrative to acknowledge the tragedy and resilience of Native peoples during and after the Wild West era. The myth of the Wild West and American identity. The Wild West has become more than just a historical period, it has become a symbol of the American identity. The ideals of rugged individualism, manifest destiny, and self-reliance that were so prominent during the frontier days, continue to resonate in American culture today. The cowboy, as both a literal figure and a symbol, represents freedom, toughness, and the spirit of overcoming adversity. Many aspects of American life, such as the entrepreneurial spirit, the value placed on personal liberty, and the celebration of frontier heroes, can trace their origins to the Wild West. It is a time and place where ordinary people, seeking to escape the constraints of civilization, took risks,
and faced challenges head-on to carve out new lives for themselves. The modern Wild West. Though the Wild West era ended in the late 19th century, its cultural influence is still seen in modern American society. The landscape of the American West, from the deserts of Arizona to the plains of Wyoming, continues to captivate the imagination of both Americans and people around the world. The imagery of cowboys and western towns remains iconic, from the streets of Hollywood to the rodeos in the heartland. Modern-day westerns, including films, TV shows and literature, still draw from the themes of the original Wild West. The genre has evolved over time, with films like No Country for Old Men 2007 and True Grit 2010 offering more nuanced, often darker portrayals of the frontier. These works are a reflection of how the Wild West myth continues to shape contemporary ideas of heroism, morality, and justice. In addition, the cowboy and ranching culture remain a defining feature of life in many Western states. The American West is still home to some of the country's most iconic ranches, and the cowboy lifestyle continues to be celebrated through rodeos, ranching festivals and Western-themed tourism. The ongoing popularity of cowboy boots, hats and Western-style clothing further demonstrates the Wild West's enduring influence on fashion and culture. The Wild West in contemporary politics. The spirit of the Wild West still finds its way into American politics. The ideas of freedom, individualism, and self-reliance are central to many political debates, especially in the Western states. Issues like gun rights, land use, and states' rights often hark back to the days of frontier justice and the fiercely independent mentality that defined much of the Wild West. In recent decades, politicians from Western states have frequently invoked the ideals of the Wild West to justify their positions on various matters, drawing upon the legacy of pioneers, cowboys, and lawmen to assert a distinct regional identity. These themes continue to shape discussions about American identity and values. Today, the spirit of the Wild West remains alive in the American imagination, whether through Hollywood films, rodeo competitions, or the preservation of Western landscapes. The Wild West continues to inspire a sense of adventure, freedom, and independence in the hearts of people around the world. The frontier, once a symbol of uncertainty and danger, has become a symbol of opportunity and possibility, one that will continue to define the American spirit for generations to come.